They said family was supposed to be sacred, that no matter what happened in life, blood or bond would protect you. But sometimes family is the first knife at your back, and it cuts deeper than betrayal from any stranger ever could. Lewis had built his life from nothing. No inheritance, no last name with weight, just empty foster homes, bruised trust, and a quiet strength that kept him going. He grew up sharing bread with boys who vanished overnight, clinging to whispers of love that rarely stayed longer than a few months. One of those boys was Mathis Wilde, unpredictable, charming to a fault. He was the only one who didn't treat Lewis like a ghost, the only one who once held his hand after lights out, whispering that they'd always have each other. Years passed. Lewis found something resembling peace. He became a respected interior designer in Portland, with a quiet apartment, a reliable car, and above all, a partner, Julianne. They met through a community fundraiser. Julian was tall, articulate, confident, the kind of man who made others listen without needing to raise his voice. He loved Lewis for his stillness, for his resilience, or so Lewis believed. Together, they decided to adopt a child, a boy named Elias, 12, with dark eyes that looked older than his years. Elias had bounced from home to home, just like Louis once had, and perhaps that's why Louis felt such urgency, such fierce determination to give him stability. They started therapy together, went to swimming lessons, picked out soft blankets and storybooks. Julian seemed distant but supportive, always busy, always handling the paperwork. Then one cold Thursday evening, it all collapsed. Lewis found a message on Julian's tablet, a single sentence glowing on the screen. He won't suspect anything. Just a few more weeks. It was signed in Mathis. At first, Lewis froze. He hadn't heard that name in over a year. Mathis had dropped by once after disappearing for half a decade. He'd asked for help. Lewis gave him a couch, some meals, a chance. Then, as quickly as he came, Mathis left. Or so Lewis thought. What followed was a night that no amount of preparation could soften. Julian confessed. It hadn't been a one-time mistake. It had been months, sometimes in their home, sometimes on work trips. Mathis had never been homeless, never been lost. He had been living in the shadow of their lives, feeding off secrets, waiting for the right moment. Lewis didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He just stared at the man he thought would raise a child with him and realized he had never truly known him at all. The next morning, Julian was gone. He left no note, took his car, his clothes, even some of Lewis's design files. Elias had a therapy appointment that day. Lewis still showed up, sat in the chair, said nothing, just stared at the floor as the boy talked about monsters in his dreams. That night, Lewis opened his old drawer. Inside was a photograph, two boys in a sun-faded backyard, arms around each other, eyes full of promises they were too young to understand. One of them was him. The other was Mathis. Sometimes, betrayal doesn't scream. It whispers. It smiles. It wears the face of someone who once said, I'll never leave you. Lewis didn't sleep that night. But as dawn broke, he made coffee, packed Elias's school bag, and folded the blankets on the couch. He wasn't just fighting for his name. He was fighting for the child who still believed in him, and for the version of himself that still wanted to believe in love. If you've ever trusted someone so much it shattered you, you are not alone. Follow Heart Stories for more real, raw, and healing journeys like this. The early days with Julianne felt like a gift Lewis never thought he deserved. He remembered the way Julianne laughed soft, low, effortless. He remembered their weekend trips, the way Julianne once knelt beside him in a field of dying lavender and whispered, "You make me feel like I belong to the world again." Lewis had held on to that sentence for years, like a prayer folded into his pocket. But now, in the silence that remained, every moment replayed with new meaning. Every missed dinner, every turned-back kiss, every time Julianne said, "You're overthinking it," had not been innocent. They were patterns. And Lewis, in his loyalty, had mistaken distance for exhaustion and betrayal for busyness. Looking peak, there were signs. Julien stopped making eye contact during conversations. His hugs became colder, almost mechanical. He no longer spoke about the future with her. He blamed Louis's concern on emotional paranoia, often reminding him how grateful he should be to have found a man who doesn't mind dating a foster case. That word, foster, it lingered like venom. And Louis realized manipulators don't always yell. They praise you just enough to keep you hoping and criticize you just enough to keep you quiet. They build a cage of compliments and close the door with a smile. Julien had always positioned himself as the one who rescued Louis, the one who introduced him to the right clients, the one who taught him to speak like someone worthy of respect. Louis had believed it was love, but it wasn't. It was grooming quiet, methodical grooming, disguised as partnership. In the months leading up to the betrayal, Julien began talking about Elias as a branding opportunity. At first, Louis dismissed it as a joke, but the language grew darker. He spoke of public events, sponsorships, and how gay couples with kids photograph better. It wasn't about building a family. It was about building an image. Louis remembered the night he came home early from Elias's therapy session. Julien was on a call. The door was slightly open. "No, I don't love him, but I owe her. This is the price. Just handle it," he had said her. At the time, Louis thought he misheard. Now he knew better. Madame Verne, his former foster mother, had always despised Louis for being gay. She once told him he would burn every home he entered. When he came out at 16, she packed his bags and left them on the sidewalk. But Mathis stayed. He was always her favorite, charming, obedient, manipulatable. If anyone could convince Julien to turn on Louis, it was her. And if anyone could offer Julien something in return, it was a woman with secrets. Louis didn't know what Julien had done, what favor she held over him, but the way he vanished, the speed with which he erased Louis from his life, the sudden legal notice demanding custody of Elias. None of it was spontaneous. It had been arranged, engineered, possibly for months. Julien claimed in his affidavit that Louis was mentally unstable. Referencing old therapy sessions from years prior, sessions he had encouraged Louis to attend, paid for, and now weaponized. He claimed the child needed a more structured, media-safe home, and that co-parenting was no longer viable. Louis sat in the courtroom, alone, so his lawyer tried to soften the blows, but it didn't matter. The damage had been done. Julien had spun the narrative, framed Louis as the unfit one, and in the eyes of a system that had failed him before. Louis feared it might happen again. But this time, he wasn't the 16-year-old boy crying on a doorstep. He was a father. He had a child to protect. And somewhere deep inside, he knew there were people watching this unfold who still hadn't heard the truth. The courthouse was colder than Louis expected. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Polished wood, artificial light, and voices that echoed more with judgment than justice. He had been in sterile places before: social services, adoption centers, state-run shelters. But this was different. This was war disguised as procedure. Louis sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his lawyer in silence. Across the aisle, Julien looked pristine, tailored gray suit, silver cufflinks, a calm demeanor that only those who planned well could afford. Next to him sat Mathis, not as a party to the case, but as a shadow. The courtroom wouldn't allow him to testify, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was a statement. The room murmured when Julien's lawyer began to speak. She painted Louis as unstable, emotionally unpredictable, overly attached to a child he had only known for months. She cited Louis's past foster care, estrangement from guardians, even a brief period in therapy after a traumatic loss at 22. Her voice was gentle, polished, every word delivered like concern, every sentence wrapped in civility. Then came Julien's declaration. He claimed he wanted to co-parent if necessary, but preferred full guardianship, arguing it would be best for Elias to grow up in a stable, media-neutral home environment. He presented photographs of himself holding Elias during one supervised outing, smiling, confident. He even submitted a letter from a social media consultant detailing the impact of diverse family structures on child perception. Lewis didn't speak. He knew if he opened his mouth, he wouldn't be able to stop. His lawyer did her best. She reminded the court that Lewis had been the one attending every therapy session, every doctor's visit, every parent-teacher conference. She produced receipts, schedules, progress reports. But documents couldn't feel. They couldn't cry. They couldn't hug back. Elias could. Lewis hadn't expected him to be called. He had been told the court would likely avoid involving the child directly. But that morning, Elias had asked to come. And when the judge asked if he wanted to say anything, the boy stood up. Not prompted, not rehearsed. His voice trembled, but didn't falter. "I want to live with Lewis," he said. "He's not just some man who takes care of me. He's my safe place." Silence fell, a heavy, disarming kind of silence. Elias continued. He spoke about the time Lewis stayed up all night when he had nightmares, how he never raised his voice, how he taught him how to swim without letting go even once. "He never asked me to smile for pictures," the boy added. "He just asked if I was okay." Then came the most unexpected words. "I was told I'd get a new school and new clothes if I said I wanted to live with Julianne. A woman told me I'd be famous, but I don't want famous. I want home." Lewis lowered his head, not out of shame, but to hold back tears that threatened to shatter his posture. Julianne's expression cracked. For the first time, his mask slipped not from rage, but from exposure. No amount of grooming, no amount of strategy could erase the clarity of a child who had learned what safety really felt like. The judge didn't give a ruling that day. It was postponed, pending review of Elias's statement and a psychological evaluation of all parties. But something shifted, a balance tipped, and not just in legal terms, an emotional weight. Lewis walked out of that room holding Elias's hand, not because he was allowed to, but because Elias reached for it first. No cameras, no consultants, just two people, bonded not by blood or contract, but by survival and truth. The days following Elias's statement were a storm behind closed doors, while the public saw a postponed verdict. Within legal corridors, the tension coiled tighter. Julian's legal team began shifting their tone, less confidence, more caution. And Lewis, though outwardly composed, knew something was about to surface. It came on a Wednesday afternoon. Quiet, gray, forgettable until the knock at Louis's door changed everything. Standing there was Camille, Julian's younger sister. Louis hadn't spoken to her in over a year. She had always been the outlier in Julian's family, observant, reserved, never fully welcomed into the curated image Julian built around his life. She clutched a small, padded envelope, eyes rimmed red but clear. "I can't be part of this anymore," she said. Inside the envelope was a USB drive, no label, no instructions, just a heavy silence between her fingers and Lewis's hands. That night, Lewis opened the files. He expected emails, maybe a conversation. But what he found was far more calculated, a full archive of voice memos, PDFs, and dated video clips, stretching back months. The first recording was Julianne's voice, sharp and efficient, discussing a strategic partnership with Madame Verne. She had reached out to him with an offer help her regain public sympathy after a foster child under her care had died from neglect years ago in exchange for her silence about Julianne's past financial fraud. It turned out Julianne had falsified income reports years prior to qualify for a government subsidy program. Nothing had ever been proven, but Madame Verne had kept the documents. Mathis, the bridge between them, played both sides. To Louis, he was the lost brother needing shelter. To Madame Verne, he was the puppet. To Julianne, he was a transaction. Another file captured Mathis boasting to a friend, "Julianne wants a kid, but not the drama." I told him, "Get Louis out of the picture. Make him look crazy." Easy. There were also screenshots. One particularly damning image showed an email from Madame Verne to Julianne, with the subject line Elias Positioning Draft. It outlined how Julianne and Mathis could appear as progressive co-parents in a media campaign about modern fatherhood. None of it was fake. Dates matched, voices were clear, metadata intact. Lewis didn't sleep that night, not because of rage that had long passed, but because of something heavier, the slow, aching confirmation that none of it had been personal to them. He had been a means to an end. Elias, even more so. They weren't discarded out of emotion. They were replaced out of strategy. The next morning, Lewis handed everything to his attorney. The courtroom was packed when the evidence was submitted. Julianne's lawyer objected, claiming the material was illegally obtained. But Camille stepped forward, quiet but firm, and testified that she had full access to Julianne's devices and that she was prepared to sign under oath that what Lewis had received was the truth. Julianne's face cracked for good this time, not with anger, but fear. Outside the courtroom, reporters buzzed, not about the custody hearing, but about a brewing fraud investigation now reopened due to Camille's statements. Madame Verne's name began resurfacing in online forums. A journalist Louis had never met emailed him asking for comment, but Lewis said nothing. He walked away from the cameras, from the noise, from the flames of a truth finally catching fire. That night, Elias crawled into his bed, pulled the blanket over both of them, and whispered, "Does this mean we don't have to fight anymore?" Lewis pulled him close. "No," he said, "it means we already won." The final ruling came quietly. No cameras, no statements, just a few pages handed to both parties, signed and sealed. The court granted Louis full and permanent guardianship of Elias. Julianne's petition was denied, and any future claims would require proof of rehabilitation and psychological evaluation. In the eyes of the law, Lewis was now, without contest, Elias's father. But it wasn't the paper that changed Louis. It was the stillness that followed. For the first time in years, he wasn't reacting. He wasn't surviving. He chose not to pursue Julianne for damages, though the evidence could have opened doors to lawsuits, possibly even prosecution. He chose not to answer interview requests or feed into the scandal that slowly unfolded around Madame Verne. And when news outlets published her name in connection with past foster care negligence, he said nothing. It wasn't indifference. It was release to us. Forgiveness didn't come like a sunrise. It came in pieces. In Elias's laughter when they walked through the farmer's market, in the way the boy hugged him in public without hesitation, in the softness Lewis found in himself again, the part that once believed in quiet mornings and safe good nights. He started rebuilding, not with grandeur, but with honesty. The design firm he'd once put on hold slowly resumed. He brought Elias to the office sometimes, letting him sit and sketch beside him. They planted a garden in the backyard, tomatoes, lavender, and a single orange tree, not because it would thrive in Portland's climate, but because Elias said orange trees look like they're always smiling. One evening, while watering that tree, Elias looked up and asked, "Do you think I'll ever have a real family?" Lewis knelt beside him and said, "You already do." Not long after, they opened a small foundation called The Fostered Heart, offering therapy access and housing resources for LGBTQ+ youth in the foster system. It wasn't big, it didn't make headlines, but it changed lives one by one, quietly, with care. Mathis disappeared from public view. Julianne's name became a whisper, a cautionary tale in networking circles. Camille stayed in touch. She sent Elias books, sometimes handmade crafts, and once wrote Lewis a letter that ended with, "You were always the best of us. We just didn't see it in time." Lewis never replied. He didn't need to. He had everything that mattered: a son who trusted him, a home filled with light, and a story that no one else could rewrite again. Forgiveness didn't erase the scars, but it made space for joy to grow around them. Have you ever let go not because they deserve peace, but because you did? Share your story in the comments. Someone out there is still learning how to begin again. And don't forget to follow Heart Stories, where healing becomes the final chapter.